When Logan Carter, a broke single father, walked into a salvage auction and bought a rusted Corvette for $300, the entire room burst out laughing. The loudest laugh belonged to Sebastian Blake, the wealthy CEO who had once dismissed Logan as a nobody not worth hiring. But nobody in that room knew what was hiding inside that rotting engine bay, a secret buried for 30 years, waiting for the one person stubborn enough to look. 4 days later, racing legend Mason Reed pulled up to Logan's front door and placed a $7 million offer on the table. Don't look away, this cheap, rusted car is about to unravel 30 years of lies and bring a powerful empire to its knees. The town of Clarksville, Ohio, did not forgive people for being poor. It didn't mock them outright, it simply moved around them, the way water moves around a stone, indifferent and unstoppable. Logan Carter had lived in that town long enough to understand exactly where he stood, at the edges, paying rent on a 2-bedroom house on the far side of Birch Street, filling out invoices by hand because he couldn't afford accounting software, and driving a truck with 240,000 miles on the odometer. He was 37 years old, and the years had been neither kind nor particularly cruel. They had simply been relentless, stacking debt on top of debt, responsibility on top of responsibility, until every morning felt like climbing a hill that grew steeper by the season. He had learned early not to wait for circumstances to improve on their own, and that particular lesson had shaped him into someone who moved through difficulty the way a good engine moved through resistance, steadily, without drama, burning what it had. His daughter Ella was 9, and she was the reason Logan got out of bed every single morning without complaint. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's quick laugh, and she had inherited some unnamed gift for finding beauty in things other people discarded. A broken radio she called the sleeping music box, a cracked flower pot she turned into a fairy garden on the windowsill, and later, a rusted car she would name with the same quiet certainty she applied to everything she loved. Ella had been born with a mild congenital heart condition, nothing immediately dangerous but enough to require regular monitoring, the occasional echocardiogram, and a stack of medical bills that Logan had been slowly, painfully working down for years. He never talked about the money in front of her, not because he was ashamed but because she was a child, and children deserved to believe the world was manageable. Logan's wife Claire had died 3 years earlier from complications following a surgery she had delayed too long because they couldn't afford it on time. The debt she left behind was not small, and Logan had absorbed it without public grievance or visible collapse, the way a load-bearing wall absorbs pressure invisibly. At cost, he had taken on every repair job that came his way, fleet vehicles for a local delivery company, weekend jobs for neighbors, oil changes and brake jobs and transmission overhauls for whoever showed up with something broken. He was talented with engines in a way no certificate could fully measure. He understood machines the way some people understood music, not just the notes, but the silence between them, the quality of the intervals, the things you could hear only when everything else went quiet. His closest friend in the world was Jason Brooks, who ran a small garage on the edge of town with the steady, unshowy loyalty that money couldn't manufacture. Jason was built wide, talked loud, and laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, which somehow made the jokes funnier. He had known Logan since they were teenagers, and he had watched his friend absorb every blow life delivered without ever crumbling. It was Jason who called on a Tuesday morning in October to mention the impound auction being held at the old warehouse off Route 7. The county was clearing seized and abandoned vehicles, and there might be useful parts going cheap. Logan had no intention of buying a car. He had no money to spend and even less space to store one, and he drove to the warehouse with a specific list and a practical mind and no ambitions beyond a carburetor. He signed in before 9, grabbed a bidding paddle he had no intention of using, and walked the rows. There were sedans, a delivery van, a motorcycle with a cracked frame, and then, at the far end of the second row, a Corvette, or what had once been a Corvette. The body was deeply oxidized, one front quarter panel crushed inward, the hood sitting unevenly, the windshield cracked in a long diagonal from corner to corner. The original paint had faded from red to the color of dried rust, and the interior had been gutted in places. By any reasonable standard, it was junk. Logan stood in front of it for a long moment, and he couldn't explain what it was he felt, only that something in the shape of the car, in the particular way it had been assembled, made him want to look closer. He leaned toward the engine bay without quite deciding to, the way a man leans toward a sound he is not entirely sure he heard. The auction began at 10 o'clock and moved with the brisk efficiency of a process nobody was particularly excited about. A county official called lot numbers while attendants rolled each vehicle into the overhead fluorescent light, and most items sold in under a minute to men who loaded them onto flatbeds and drove away without ceremony. It was a businesslike morning, devoid of drama, until Lot 23 was brought forward and the Corvette came fully into view, and the mood shifted from boredom into something lighter and more unkind. Sebastian Blake had arrived with 2 assistants and the practiced ease of someone who appeared at these events not to find value but to confirm that other people couldn't. He was 45, trim and silver-haired in the way expensive grooming produced, wearing a jacket that cost more than Logan earned in a week. He ran Blake Motors, one of the most recognized luxury automotive dealerships and restoration houses in the Midwest, and he moved through the warehouse with the unhurried confidence of a man who expected the room to orient itself around him. He noticed Logan almost immediately and took a moment to place the face. 2 years earlier, Logan had applied for a senior technician role at Blake Motors. The resume had been solid, but Logan held no credentials from an accredited program, and Sebastian had a standing preference for pedigree over experience, so the application had lasted under a minute. Seeing the man here in a flannel shirt with a cracked phone in his breast pocket confirmed something Sebastian had already decided. Logan, for his part, paid no attention to Sebastian. He was crouching beside the Corvette, running a hand along the undercarriage with the quiet focus of someone reading a language invisible to the untrained eye. The frame was original, he was almost certain of that. The damage was surface level, ugly but not structural. He leaned under the hood for less than 30 seconds and his eyes stopped on 3 things in rapid sequence: a set of numerals on the firewall that had been partially sanded but not erased, a custom bent aluminum brace that no factory line would have produced, and a small stamped marking near the base of the intake manifold that he had never seen on a production vehicle. He straightened up with the expression of someone who has just heard a word in a conversation they were not supposed to be having. The bidding opened at $150, and the laughter started almost immediately. Someone near the back shouted that the city should pay them to take it away. Sebastian smiled thinly, his eyes moving to Logan with an expression of mild entertainment, the particular satisfaction of a man whose sense of the world's order was being confirmed. When Logan raised his paddle at $300, the room shifted from quiet amusement into open laughter, the reflexive sound of a crowd reacting to someone doing the thing they expected him to do. Sebastian spoke loud enough to carry across the floor, saying Logan had just purchased himself a coffin on wheels, and several men around him obliged with laughter. An older dealer near the door said Logan would spend more on the tow than the car was worth. Logan did not respond to any of this. He took the confirmation slip from the attendant, folded it carefully, and placed it in his chest pocket. His face was calm, with the particular calm of someone who had decided the room's opinion was simply not relevant data. Jason was waiting by the truck with a coffee and a look of profound concern. He asked Logan if he had actually done it. Logan told him to pull the truck around. Jason stared at the Corvette for a long moment, then burst out laughing, but it was a different kind of laugh entirely. The kind that comes from affection rather than contempt, and it held more warmth than anything else said in that warehouse all morning. They secured the car to the tow hitch while the auction wound down around them, and as they drove out through the lot, Logan glanced once in the rearview mirror at the Corvette dragging behind them in the pale October light. He felt no triumph, no certainty, no particular clarity about what he had done, only the specific gravity of a decision made and not regretted, the weight of something he didn't yet understand but was not willing to let go. Jason's garage sat on a quarter-acre lot backing up to a drainage ditch, and it smelled permanently of oil and old rubber and the metallic sweetness of brake dust, which Logan had always found more comforting than any candle. They rolled the Corvette inside and left it under the fluorescence while they debated whether Logan had made a reasonable decision or a spectacular mistake. The available evidence leaned toward the latter. The car was worse up close. The driver's door had been welded shut and poorly recut, the floorboards patched with mismatched sheet metal, the seats replaced with vinyl inserts cracked and peeling. Every surface told a story of improvised repair and accumulated neglect, and underneath all of it, something else, a quality of deliberate concealment that Logan could feel before he could name it. Ella came to the garage after school, and the moment she saw the car, she walked around it twice without speaking. Then she pressed her palm flat against the crumpled front quarter panel and announced that its name was Red Ghost, because it was red under all the rust, and because only the right person could see it. Logan told her it wouldn't run for a very long time. Ella said that was fine, that ghosts were patient. Jason found this so funny he nearly spilled his coffee, and the mood in the garage shifted into something warmer and less certain of its own pessimism. Logan spent the next 2 evenings doing what he did best, taking things apart slowly enough to understand them. He worked through the engine bay systematically with a flashlight and a clipboard, and what he found as he went deeper was increasingly difficult to explain as coincidence. Several internal components were not stock hand-machined parts, identified by tooling marks and the specific geometry of the cuts, the kind of finish that automated manufacturing did not produce. Someone had built portions of this engine by hand, with a precision that far exceeded anything a restoration shop would have bothered to apply to a car in this condition. On the second night, working alone after Ella was asleep, Logan found a small aluminum plate mounted to the rear of the engine block in a position invisible without full disassembly, a rectangle roughly the size of a playing card, engraved with 2 capital letters and a year. R. 1969. He sat on his stool and looked at it for a while, turning the implication over like a piece of hardware he hadn't yet identified. The photograph changed everything. It was tucked behind the dash, wedged between the firewall and the instrument cluster, protected by 3 layers of dried foam padding compressed over decades into something close to cardboard. The image was black and white, burned at one corner as if someone had tried to destroy it and then reconsidered. It showed a young man, perhaps mid-20s, standing beside a Corvette that was unmistakably this same car, the custom brace visible through the open hood, the same distinctive front valance. The young man was grinning with the uncomplicated joy of someone who has built something remarkable and knows it, a racing helmet tucked under one arm. At the bottom of the photograph, a signature written in ink faded to pale gray. Logan photographed it and enlarged it on his phone screen in the bathroom that night while Ella slept, and the letters resolved slowly out of the blur. Read. He turned off the light and sat in the dark and thought about what it meant to find a name in a place where no name was supposed to be. It was Jason who introduced the complication. He had shared a photograph of the Corvette with an automotive acquaintance of his, and while that man had not responded, the image had circulated further than intended. Within 48 hours of the auction, a photograph showing the car's distinctive welded door repair and the partial view of the custom aluminum brace had moved into the peripheral vision of someone with very specific reasons to recognize it. Sebastian Blake was eating breakfast in his office when his assistant placed a tablet in front of him. He looked at the photograph for 4 seconds, set down his fork, and looked again. He asked where it had come from. He was told it was the Lot 23 vehicle from the county auction. Sebastian set the tablet down and was quiet for an unusually long time, unusual for a man who had opinions about everything and delivered them without invitation. He knew what that door repair looked like. He had seen photographs of it before, in files stored nowhere near a company server. His father had described it once, briefly, in the context of a problem that had been managed a long time ago, a story Sebastian had understood well enough to know it was never to be raised in meetings. The geometry of the aluminum brace was also familiar, the signature of an engineer who was no longer alive and had left no documentation that Sebastian's family hadn't already worked very hard to eliminate. He made 3 calls before 9 in the morning. The third went to Gary Oakes, who handled acquisitions and was trusted to move quickly and ask minimal questions. Sebastian told him to contact the mechanic, make the approach appear casual, and offer $5,000 for the Corvette, frame it as a restoration house doing a poor man a favor. He emphasized that the offer should not seem urgent. Gary Oakes arrived at the garage that Thursday afternoon while Logan was mid-teardown with both hands inside the engine bay, and introduced himself as a representative of an enthusiast group. He said $5,000 in cash by the end of the week, in a tone calibrated to sound friendly and offhand. But Logan had spent enough time reading machines to recognize when something was running at a pressure it wasn't designed to sustain. He wiped his hands on a rag and told Gary the car was not for sale. Gary's expression flickered once, then smoothed over, and he said the offer remained open and left. After he was gone, Jason appeared from behind the truck he had been pretending to work on and observed that $5,000 was a lot of money for a car that didn't run. Logan said he was aware of that. He put his hands back in the engine and kept working, Grace Miller had a small office above a dry cleaning shop on Delancey Street, earned without inherited advantage, built entirely from sustained effort. Logan had helped her 2 years earlier when her Civic blew a front axle on an ice-covered road outside his house. He had spent 3 cold hours on the repair and refused payment, and they had stayed in casual contact since. Grace was 32 and sharp in the specific way that came from having been underestimated enough times to stop being surprised by it. When Logan arrived on a Friday morning with a manila envelope of photographs and a request that sounded more than slightly improbable, she listened to all of it without interrupting. She pulled records over a weekend, and what she found took her from mildly curious to genuinely alarmed within a single afternoon. The Corvette's title history was a document in mutilation. The earliest registration records had been actively expunged from the county database, not lost, not misfiled, but removed, which required either a direct clerical order or someone with administrative-level access. The vehicle identification number had been reissued in the late 1970s under a different format, suggesting a deliberate legal repackaging of the car's identity. A corporate name appeared twice in the chain of custody, a shell company called Apex Vehicle Holdings, which Grace traced through 2 layers of incorporation to a parent entity dissolved in 2004. That parent company had been a wholly owned subsidiary of Blake Automotive Group. Grace told Logan that this was the kind of financial and administrative architecture you constructed when you were concealing something you couldn't openly hold, and that his ownership of the vehicle was clean, but that the history attached to it was not. Logan went back to the garage and told Jason everything. They worked through the weekend in near silence, systematically disassembling the lower chassis. On Sunday afternoon, Jason's pry bar struck something under the driver's side floor panel that produced the wrong sound, metal against a sealed cavity rather than solid structure. They removed the panel section and found a steel box bolted from the inside to the frame rail in a configuration that required partial disassembly to access. The lock was corroded but not seized. Logan drilled it out carefully. The way you approached a thing you suspected was significant. Inside, wrapped in a waterproof sleeve that had done its job for 30 years, were 3 items. The first was a set of technical drawings, 8 pages of engineering specifications for a modified racing engine, annotated in the compressed handwriting of someone trained in precision draftsmanship. The second was a collection of photographs of the Corvette at a track facility, surrounded by men in period racing attire, dated August 1969. The third was an unsealed envelope containing a single handwritten letter, addressed to no one. The letter was from a man who identified himself only by his initials R.V., and it described, in specific technical language, how a prototype racing engine had been removed from a competitor's vehicle in the week before a national championship event. It described how that removal had been authorized by an executive at a corporate sponsor, a name Logan recognized from the filings Grace had pulled as the founder of what would later become Blake Automotive Group. It described how the removal had been disguised as the discovery of an unauthorized equipment modification, when in fact the modification had been entirely legitimate and fully documented, and the theft had been the actual violation. And it named the driver whose career had been destroyed by the false accusation, Mason Reed. Logan sat on the garage floor with the letter in his hands and the overhead light humming above him, and he understood that he was holding the end of something that had started before he was born. The black car arrived at Logan's house on a Monday morning, 4 days after the auction. Logan was on the front steps with Ella's backpack beside him, waiting for the school carpool, when the long dark sedan pulled quietly to the curb. The man who stepped out moved with the careful economy of someone who had once been extraordinarily capable in physical situations and still carried the muscle memory even if the years had moderated the pace. He was in his mid-70s, silver-haired and lean, with posture that came from a lifetime of fitting into small spaces and demanding precision from a human body. Logan had been studying Mason Reed's face for 4 days, in old racing magazines pulled from Jason's storage shelf, in archive images on his phone late at night, in the photograph hidden in the dash of the car. In person, Mason was smaller than expected and simultaneously more present, the way certain people carried a quality of attention so complete that the surrounding space reorganized around them. He walked straight to the Corvette in the driveway and stood in front of it without speaking for a long time. His hands were at his sides. His face held the stillness of someone applying significant internal force to remain composed, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady but carried something in it that belonged to grief. the kind that has been held long enough to become indistinguishable from the person holding it. He said he had spent 31 years believing this car had been crushed. He said he had made his peace with that, or the practical version of peace that lets a person keep going. A contact had passed along information about an unusual vehicle from a county auction, and he had come without knowing exactly what he would find. Seeing it here confirmed something he had kept faith with against all reasonable evidence. He told the story in pieces, standing in the driveway while the morning turned cold around them. In 1969, he had been 24 and the best prepared driver of his generation, operating a prototype Corvette built by a private engineer named Robert Vasquez, a man of extraordinary talent who had spent 3 years developing something genuinely ahead of its time. 2 weeks before the national championship, the car was in a secured facility. 1 week before the race, it was gone. Officials received a report claiming the vehicle had been illegally modified. The accusation was investigated, the championship entry was disqualified, and Mason's career collapsed in a single week. Robert Vasquez died of a heart attack 8 months later. The car was never found. Logan listened without interrupting. When Mason finished, Logan asked who had taken it. Mason looked toward the city skyline, a pale suggestion above the tree line at the end of the street, and said the name with the precision of someone who had spoken it many times in private but rarely aloud: the Blake family. Ella was watching from behind the screen door, and Logan turned once to look at her, then turned back. He was quiet in the way he was quiet when thinking through something mechanical, not rushing the conclusion, letting the problem show him its own shape. He told Mason he wasn't ready to give him an answer yet. Mason said that was a man's right, and that he would wait. Sebastian Blake understood that Mason Reed's visit to Birch Street changed the nature of the situation, and he moved with the decisive energy that had built his family's company into a regional institution. He instructed his legal team to file a formal challenge to the auction sale, citing alleged irregularities in the original seizure documentation. He had his communications team prepare materials positioning the situation as a case of exploitation, an unqualified individual who had stumbled onto something historically significant and was attempting to leverage it for personal gain. The materials did not name Logan directly but described him in terms recognizable enough to make the identifications unnecessary. The coverage that followed was not kind. A local business publication speculated about clouded title and questioned whether impound auctions were the appropriate venue for historically significant vehicles. An automotive blog described the Corvette as potentially stolen property being held by an amateur restorer with no expertise to assess what he had. A brief item in a regional news aggregator referred to Logan simply as a Clarksville mechanic, the phrase deployed with just enough editorial distance to imply that a Clarksville mechanic was not the kind of person whose judgment deserved to be trusted with something of consequence. None of it was accurate in any specific respect, but accuracy was not the goal. The goal was uncertainty, and uncertainty in the absence of a counter-narrative had a way of becoming the default position, a fog that settled over the truth and asked everyone to wait while someone more credentialed sorted it out. Ella came home from school 2 days after Mason's visit with a subdued quality Logan had learned to read over years of careful attention. At dinner, she told him that some kids had been saying her dad had found a stolen car and was trying to get famous from it. She said she had told them that wasn't true, and the confidence in her voice was brave and slightly brittle, the way children's confidence was when they were absorbing something they couldn't fully name. Logan set down his fork and looked at his daughter across the small table and felt the particular interior temperature of a man who has absorbed many blows and is measuring how close the margin has grown. Grace called him that evening. She had reviewed the legal challenge and said it was largely without merit. The auction sale had been conducted through proper county channels. The title transfer was clean, and Logan's ownership was not legitimately contestable under current statute. Sebastian's lawyers knew this, she said, and the challenge was designed not to succeed in court but to generate response costs and sufficient uncertainty to make Logan willing to settle. His best defense was the evidence itself, not the manufactured kind, but the documented kind that didn't require anyone's belief because it spoke without assistance. Logan talked to Jason late that night, sitting in the garage next to the Corvette under the work lamp. Jason asked straight out whether Logan wanted to sell the car to Mason, take the money, and end all of it. Logan said he had thought about it. Then he said Ella had looked at him across that dinner table with the expectation that he was the kind of man who didn't choose the easy thing when the right thing was visible, and that was not an expectation he was prepared to betray. Jason was quiet for a moment, then said he supposed they had better get this sorted. They sat for a while longer in the quiet of the garage, with the Corvette between them and the wind pressing against the walls. Mason Reed's name still meant something in the racing world, not the way it had in 1969, when it had meant the future of American motorsport, but in the deeper, more durable way of an injustice that people in the community had never fully accepted. When Mason announced, through his attorney, that he intended to hold a public event at the Clarksville Regional Speedway to address the circumstances of his disqualification and present new evidence, the response was significant. Journalists came from across the state. Several people who had been present at the original 1969 race agreed to attend as observers. 2 retired officials from the national racing body drove in the night before. Logan spent the night before the event at Jason's garage. The 3 of them, Logan, Jason, and Grace, worked until 3 in the morning preparing the Corvette not to race but to run, which was its own considerable challenge given the state of the engine. Logan replaced what needed replacing and left intact everything that was original, including every custom component that bore the fingerprint of Robert Vasquez's craftsmanship. When they finished and stood back looking at the car under the fluorescent light, none of them said anything for a moment. The car looked exactly like what it was, something that had survived a very long time by staying hidden, brought back into the light by a man who had paid $300 for the privilege of understanding it. The speedway was cold and bright the next morning. Sebastian Blake arrived mid-morning with 2 lawyers and the confident composure that was armor rather than mood. He had not been formally invited but understood that his absence would read as admission. He positioned himself in the media area and waited with the patience of someone who had decided the day would go a particular way and was simply waiting for everyone else to arrive at the same conclusion. When asked about the allegations, he said he had come to set the record straight, that the 1969 disqualification had been properly adjudicated, and that the vehicle in question was part of a provenance dispute being addressed through appropriate channels. He delivered all of it with the smooth, unhurried cadence of a man who had given the same answer in many different rooms. Grace spoke first from the table near the start line, laying out the title chain, the corporate structure of Apex Vehicle Holdings, the connection to Blake Automotive Group, and the administrative removal of the original registration records. She spoke in the evidence-based language of a lawyer presenting facts to a room that had agreed to listen, which was the only language she trusted. Mason spoke next, without notes. He described the 1969 season, the car, Robert Vasquez, and the morning the car was missing, and the weeks during which he had tried to produce evidence and found that the evidence had been managed away from him. His voice was steady throughout, and Logan, standing to the side with Jason, understood that whatever peace Mason had made with this story over 30 years was the kind of peace that required daily maintenance, and that maintaining it had cost something compounding and real. Logan stepped forward when it was his turn. He opened the steel box and removed its contents methodically, the engineering drawings, the track photographs, the letter from Robert Vasquez, laying each item on the table and stating clearly where it had been found, how the box had been sealed, and what connected the car to Mason Reed. Sebastian began to speak, raising his voice, calling it theater, saying the documents were unverified, saying Mason was weaponizing nostalgia and Logan was a man without credentials using someone else's story to elevate himself. Logan did not look at Sebastian while he spoke. He walked to the Corvette, checked the ignition connection he had made the night before, and turned the key. The engine turned over twice and caught, and the sound it produced was not the sound of a rebuilt car, it was the sound of something that had been built right in the first place and had never forgotten how. Deep, even, and completely authoritative, it filled the speedway with a quality of mechanical voice that brought the entire crowd to silence. Mason walked from the table to the front of the car and placed his right hand on the hood, and his lips moved but produced no sound. The press photographed him from multiple angles. Sebastian Blake stood very still in the media area, and the 2 lawyers beside him began a rapid, quiet conversation with each other that carried none of the confidence of the morning. The coda came not in the speedway but in the parking lot afterward, in a conversation between Mason and Logan that lasted 11 minutes and contained more weight than most exchanges that lasted for years. The crowd had thinned to journalists and a few remaining observers, and the two men stood beside the Corvette on its trailer in the pale winter light while Grace organized papers nearby and Jason sat on the truck hood eating from a bag of chips with the particular composure of a man who had decided his part was finished and the rest belonged to other people. Mason said the offer stood, exactly as made, $7 million for the Corvette, unconditionally, regardless of how the legal proceedings ultimately resolved. The car had been found. The evidence was public. The truth had been stated and couldn't be efficiently unsaid. Logan thought about all the things $7 million would do. He thought about Ella's cardiologist appointments and the stack of bills and the debt his wife had left behind that he had been carrying like a wound that hadn't quite healed. He thought about options, which were the one thing poverty most effectively eliminated, and the one thing he had spent 3 years without. He thought about his daughter pressing her palm to that crumpled quarter panel and naming something nobody else could see, and about what he wanted her to understand concerning the relationship between value and visibility. He told Mason he would accept on 2 conditions. The first was that $1 million from the proceeds be placed in a foundation supporting children with congenital heart conditions whose families could not afford surgical intervention. Mason agreed before Logan finished the sentence. The second condition was that a designated portion fund structured apprenticeships, paid, credentialed training for young people from low-income backgrounds who wanted to work in mechanical trades. Mason said he would personally double that contribution. Logan signed the paperwork Grace had prepared in advance, because Grace had understood before the Speedway event how this was likely to end and had thought it sensible to be ready. With the portion that came to him after the foundation was funded, Logan did one specific thing first. He went to the bank and paid off every outstanding medical bill in a single transaction, then sat in his truck in the parking lot for several minutes afterward, doing nothing in particular. Then he called Jason and told him he was interested in buying the garage. Jason said he had been hoping Logan would say exactly that. They agreed on a price and shook hands in the parking lot of a diner where they had eaten lunch every Tuesday for 11 years, and Logan felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. 4 months after the Speedway event, the Corvette was installed in the National Automotive Heritage Museum in a permanent exhibition on American racing history. The placard beside it read, in simple typeface, Red Ghost Prototype Racing Vehicle, 1969, designed by Robert Vasquez, driven by Mason Reed, recovered by Logan Carter. The car was displayed without restoration, its history of damage and repair left visible, because both the curators and Mason agreed that the history was the point. A photograph of Robert Vasquez was mounted beside it, taken in a workshop in the spring of 1968. The engineer bent over the engine with the expression of someone who knows he is making something worth making. Sebastian Blake resigned his position as chief executive of Blake Motors 14 weeks after the Speedway event, citing health reasons, a formulation his communications team had arrived at after consulting with legal counsel. The corporate investigation commissioned by the Blake Motors Board found sufficient cause to refer several matters to state regulators. The precise outcomes would take years to conclude, as these things always did, but the direction was established. The name Blake Motors remained on dealerships across the Midwest, but the man who had believed his family's name was untouchable had learned, in a parking lot in a press room in a cold Speedway in October, that the things you buried had a tendency to resurface when someone stubborn enough came along and started looking. The foundation Logan had stipulated was named the Vasquez Reed Fund, at Mason's insistence, because the men who had suffered deserved to have their names on the thing that came from their suffering. In its first operational year, it provided surgical support for 11 children and funded apprenticeships for 23 young people in automotive and mechanical trades. Logan ran the apprenticeship component personally, working in the garage beside his students the way he had always worked, with his hands, with patience, without performing a competence he expected others to accept on faith. Ella's follow-up echocardiogram in February came back better than projected. She had started a school project on Robert Vasquez, having read about him in the museum materials, and had asked Logan to help her understand the engineering drawings. He had sat with her at the kitchen table for 3 evenings going through the specifications, and had found, in explaining the work of a man who died before either of them were born, that the drawings were extraordinarily beautiful in the way that precise things made by committed hands always were. On the day the museum opened the exhibition to the public, Logan and Ella stood together in front of the Corvette for a long time. The car was lit from above, its damaged body and repaired surfaces and the full record of its history all visible at once, not cleaned into something easier to look at, but present in its complete form. Logan remembered the laughter in the warehouse, the sound of a room full of people, certain they understood what they were looking at. He thought about the $300 he had spent, and the thing it had turned out to be, and the way value had a habit of waiting, patient and undemonstrative, for someone willing to stop and look. Ella slipped her hand into his and said she thought Red Ghost was happy here. Logan looked at the car, then at his daughter, then back at the car, and said he thought she was probably right. They walked out of the museum together into the winter light, and behind them, in the quiet of the exhibition hall, the Corvette stood exactly as it was, proof that the things other people threw away sometimes held everything that mattered, and that the people others dismissed were sometimes the only ones capable of seeing it. The laughter in that auction warehouse had been certain and immediate and collective, the sound of a room without doubt, but certainty without attention was just noise, and Logan Carter had always known the difference between the two.